Hey guys, welcome to the Thursday edition of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about 5 albums that really kind of changed my life. There's a bunch of links down below. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for our merch page. There's links for the Vinyl Den Spotify and Apple Music weekly playlist that we put together, and also the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. Like a lot of you out there, music has been a really big, important thing to me over my entire life. I've always called it the soundtrack of your life. I can put on specific albums, and it immediately takes me back to, a very specific point in my life. And all 5 of these albums, like I said, are ones that have changed me in one way or another. It really could have been even longer. I had a hard time kind of narrowing it down to just 5. But these are kind of like I think probably the core 5 albums that over the course of my life, I continue to kind of go back to time and time again. I will say that none of these 5 are in any kind of order. It's almost kind of random. But the first one is one that was really important to me when I was young. It was released in November of 1982. So I was 3 years old, actually, when this album came out. But it was probably 83, like later part of 83, when I actually got this album on vinyl. And it's probably it is my earliest memory that I have, is sitting in my room with one of those little plastic, Fisher Price, I don't know what brand it was, but one of those little plastic turntables, listening to this album. Of course, that is Thriller by Michael Jackson. I've talked about on the show here several times how important this album was to me when I was a kid. Obviously, it's one of the highest selling albums of all time, but it was this album that really kind of, at that time, I was really only listening to, obviously, the stuff that my parents listened to. I was, 4 years old when I first got on vinyl. But, this was an album that kind of, helped kind of separate me from, a lot of the stuff my parents were listening to. At that time was a lot of like country and, 70s rock and things like that. But Michael Jackson with Thriller was almost a very revolutionary album to me as a very young child, and one that I love to this day and still put on pretty regularly. While Thriller wasn't a huge departure from what my parents were listening to in the early 80s, this next album is one that was very, very different than what my parents were fans of. And that album is, of course, released in 1987, Appetite for Destruction. I want to say it was like late September 87 when Welcome to the Jungle was released. At least the video was, and it was all over MTV. I remember seeing it. I felt like every 5 minutes they were playing that video. Absolutely loved that song. And it, like I said, it was very different from one of the stuff I was listening to at that time. I was starting to kind of get into some hair metal stuff, dragging further and further away from the stuff my parents listened to from the 60s and 70s. But with Appetite for Destruction, I still remember, it was probably, so if Welcome to the Jungle came out in September, it was probably October, maybe early part of November. I remember finally convincing my parents to take me to the store and let me buy this cassette. And with me only being 8 years old, it was an album that, I really kind of grabbed onto pretty quick. And this is the album that kind of led me into a lot of other stuff in 87, 88, 89, going into I got into Metallica and definitely some heavier stuff than even what Guns N' Roses was doing on Appetite for Destruction. But to this day, it's still one of my top 10 favorite albums of all time. So after I got into Guns N' Roses, I kind of stayed in that, hard rock, heavy metal kind of phase, whether it was Guns N' Roses, Metallica. I got into a little bit of Anthrax, some other kind of heavy metal bands in that late 80s, early 90s period. And then in 1991, this next album came out and kind of changed everything, changed my entire listening habits for much of the next, 30 years. Of course, that album released in 1991 is Nevermind by Nirvana. The crazy thing is about this album, at its peak, Nevermind was selling 300,000 copies a week, which is an insane number. There's albums that never sell that many, ever, and they were doing that in a week. So this came out in, I think it was September of 91. It wasn't until my parents bought me the cassette for Christmas of that year. And really, that was what the album that really opened up the door. Even though Nevermind is nowhere close to being my favorite grunge album, but it really led me into bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Mudhoney, a lot of those bands that from that early '90s period, they were just doing a bunch of great things. But at least here in southeastern Michigan, wasn't getting nearly the radio play that it really deserved. And I think MTV really kind of helped spur that whole grunge era in the early '90s. The next album is one that, if I had to pick out of the five, is probably the most important album to me because it's one that really opened up the door to a very different style of music that I probably wouldn't have listened to had it not been for this album. And in the mid 90s, it really wasn't getting the same thing with grunge in the early 90s here in Michigan. In the mid 90s, punk wasn't really getting played a whole lot either. And then in 1995, And Out Come the Wolves by Rancid gets released and really kind of changed everything. I want to say it was like August or September 95 is when this album came out. And I didn't really hear or listen to it at all until I think it was like the very end of 95, very beginning of 1996. I was over at my friend Corey's house and we were watching MTV, and the video for Ruby Soho came on, and like instantly I was just drawn to it. And over the next probably 6 months, I listened to that album absolutely nonstop. It never came out of my cassette deck in my house. And to this day, it's one I still listen to. If not every week, it's every other couple of weeks that I listen to it. But it was this album that really opened up the door to bands like Operation Ivy, a lot of those other great punk bands. I got into the Ramones, all in that same kind of time frame just because of how great this album is. I'm a big punk fan. I've been a big punk fan since I first listened to this album, and I always consider this album like the number one punk album ever released. The last one I got on the list is one that's probably a little different. It's definitely a different meaning to me than the other four albums. This is actually a pretty recent album. This was released back in 2018. And this is the album that got me actually back into vinyl, and that is the self-titled album by MXPX. Of course, I'm a huge MXPX fan. I've been for a really long time. The funny thing was, back in 2018, the band started. They weren't on a label. They did a Kickstarter fund to crowdsource funding to record their new album. So the goal for the Kickstarter was $50,000. And I want to say they raised like $200 or right around $250,000 from that Kickstarter fund, and this was the result. They part of the Kickstarter that they did was you paid into the fund, or you donated money to the fund, and one of the things you get was a record. And obviously, as someone that grew up loving music, loving vinyl records. I had records from the time I was born until, after I graduated high school, I was still listening to vinyl. So, it was definitely an appeal to me. It's something actually that I talked about getting back into even before I saw that. But that was definitely like the icing on the cake for me. Of course, I was going to donate to their Kickstarter, but, it was that, that kind of pushed me over the edge, and I've been off and running since this album came out. But if you haven't listened to this album, it's a great album. It's definitely a great 2000s punk rock album, and it's not my favorite MXPX album, but it is the album that kind of led me to where I am now. Had it not been for this, I would never probably not gotten back into vinyl records, and I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you on the YouTube channel today. But this is the album that kind of started it all. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. That's just 5 albums. I could have went on. It could have easily been a list of, 15, 20 albums that have been, hugely important to me over my life. But drop me a comment down below and let me know what you guys think. What are some, hugely important albums or albums that have really kind of changed your musical interests over the years? Let me know what you guys think. Of course, if you enjoy the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.